All right, there we go. So if you are watching this video, you are probably a rookie or novice competitor at the MDTA Jamboree. Welcome to debate. We're happy to have you here. Excited to have you do some debating today. This morning, we're going to start off. We're just going to watch a demo debate video together. We're just going to see, what it sounds like, what it looks like. The two people we're going to be watching in the debate are one is a former Minnesota debater. They're both current debaters at Emory University, and they're going to provide you a really high-level example of what debate can look like. So before we get into that, I should introduce myself. My name is Jake Swede. I'm the program director over at the Minnesota Urban Debate League. I help run some of the tournaments here in Minnesota. You'll probably see me around this season and in future seasons. Today, when we watch this debate, you don't really have to do anything except take notes and write down any questions or comments that you have. So the way that we take notes in debate is actually, it has a special term, it's called flowing. So flowing helps us see which arguments were made in each speech of the debate so that we can see, who made what arguments, what are the important arguments, which arguments did the other team respond to, and sort of how did the debate play out across the entirety of the debate? What do the arguments look like, right? So the way that we're going to do that is I want you to find a sheet of paper like this. It can be lined, unlined, color paper, not whatever. And I want you to hold it lengthwise like this. I know some of your coaches are going to tell you to do it like this, but I want you to have enough space to write. And as rookie and novices, it's probably better to do it like this. So hold it lengthwise, and I want you to fold it in half once. Get a nice crease to it. Fold it in half again. And then fold it in half a third time. And you want to do this before every debate. You want to make sure you have your flow ready and set together. And the reason we're doing this to fold it in half 3 times is that when you fold it in half 3 times, what you get are 8 really nice columns. And these columns, these 8 columns are going to be the 8 speeches that you flow throughout the entirety of the debate. So starting in the first affirmative constructive, first negative constructive, second affirmative constructive, second negative constructive, etc., and going through all of the different speeches in debate. I'm actually not going to flow on paper because it's going to be pretty hard for me to show you what's going on if we flow on paper. So I am going to screen share. There we go. And I'll just be using an online template. I've already watched the debate and flowed it. There's 5 speeches, so it's a little bit different than your normal debate. They just cut down the speeches for a demo debate. So instead of flowing alongside with you, I've already put down all the arguments, and we can just go through them as the debate happens. And then this is, of course, the debate we'll actually be watching. It's Secreti on the affirmative versus Trinity on the negative. And Clay Edwards is going to jump in every once in a while to give commentary. I'm going to jump in and give a little commentary also, just to help keep things moving and show what's happening. So the few things I want to note before we get into this debate is, first, in your normal debates, there will be 8 total speeches, and each debater will give 2 of those speeches. But in this debate, it's a demo debate, and they shorten the times. And there's only 1 person for each side. So they're going to be giving different amounts of speeches at different times that are not the same as yours. Don't worry about that. The only thing to worry about for this debate is the arguments that are being made and making sure you can sort of flow and understand and follow along with the arguments. The second thing to note is that these are 2 very high level, highly experienced, very competitive debaters, right? What they're showing you is something to aspire to, a level to aspire to, not a level to expect in your own actual debates today. So if you feel like, wow, they're really good, they're so articulate, they're so smart, they really understand the evidence, that's good. That's their job. That's why they're doing the demo debate. But you shouldn't expect your opponents to be on this level, and you shouldn't expect yourself to be on this level yet. By the end of the season, when you know the evidence, you're really confident, you're going to be debating like this, but it's a process to work up to, right? And then the third thing to note is that the topic they're using is about criminal justice reform, but they're talking more about prison reform, whereas our evidence and topic talks more about police reform. So they're a little bit different, but they have a lot of interrelated concepts, right? So just focus on the main ideas, go through the debate, listen, and try to get the most out of it that you can. And hopefully you're there with one of your coaches and with your fellow debaters, and you can pause and ask questions and talk with each other and figure things out as you go through. But even if you're watching this on your own, you should still write down questions and comments that, you know, after the debate, once you all are done, you can talk together. And also, we're going to provide a room on Zoom where you can come and talk to debate experts about what happened in this practice debate. So that's probably enough from me. Let's start things off with Sukriti giving the first speech.
Greetings. My partner and I propose the following plan. The United States federal government should pass the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act. The contention one is inherency. Despite the recent First Step Act, more than 2 million people are incarcerated in the United States. That's Wavell in 2019, columnist for the Washington Post. Trump received applause when he first touted the First Step Act. The act includes provision reducing some federal sentences and allowing incarcerated individuals to qualify for early release. The law is only a step. Mass incarceration remains one of the greatest civil rights issues of our time. The U.S. has the highest rate in the world, including a disproportionate number of Black and Brown Americans. First Step Act only applies to federal prisons. It didn't help nearly 90% of the incarcerated population in state and local facilities. Contention 2 is solvency. First, the plan ends mass incarceration. Changing federal financial incentives is key. That's Eisen and Chattiar, 2015, analysts at the Brennan Center for Justice. Our prison crisis has many causes. One major contributor, perverse financial incentives that spurred more arrests, prison sentences. A crime bill, an example is 94. Our prime example is the 94 crime bill, which authorized $19 billion to states. The federal government played an outsized role by financially subsidizing states to incarcerate more people. The federal government spends $3.8 billion to states each year and localities each year, largely focused on increasing the size of our justice system. It can now encourage them to reduce incarceration. The Reverse Mass Incarceration Act would encourage a 20% reduction in imprisonment. Such an act would have 4 components: a federal grant program of over $20 billion over 10 years in incentive funds to states, a requirement that states reduce their prison population by 7% over a 3-year period without an increase in crime, a clear methodology based on population size and other factors to determine how much states receive, and a requirement that these states invest these funds in evidence-based programs proven to reduce crime and incarceration. Second, funding is key. States will change policies and receive federal grants. That's Shelton and Eisen in 2017. For decades, federal government has sent out grants to states and cities on autopilot to aid anti-crime initiatives. States and cities seek these additional dollars and are willing to modify policy to get them. Almost all funds ultimately allocated by Congress from '94 were used by states to build more prisons and lengthen sentences. This new measure is designed to redirect the flow to upend the incentive. It would authorize $20 billion in incentive funds over 10 years to states that cut their prison population by 7% every 3 years. Some states are already on a path to do this. This bill will encourage further progress. The advantage is poverty. First, prison is the new poverty trap, creating a cycle of social inequality. That's tyranny in 2013. Prison has become the new poverty trap. It has become a routine event for poor African-American men and their families. For Black men without a high school diploma, the incarceration rate is nearly 40%. They're more likely to be behind bars than have a job. Prisoners serve significantly more time in the U.S. than in most other industrialized countries. Sentences for drug-related offenses have gotten stiffer. Prosecutors have become more aggressive. When sociologists look for causes of child poverty and juvenile delinquency, they link these to the incarceration of parents and the resulting economic and emotional strains on families. Education, income, housing, health, incarceration affects everyone and everything. Low-income neighborhoods and in low-income neighborhoods. There was already evidence linking problems in poor neighborhoods to single-parent households and mobility. Those trends have been amplified. The prison's rooms coercive mobility. That was
Now they're going to do cross-examination. So Trinity is going to ask some questions of Secreti.
Are you ready to do cross-ex?
Yeah.
Start my timer. So my first question is, can you explain the specific differences between your plan and the First Step Act?
Sure. So first of all, the First Step Act only applied to federal prisons. So as our card states, that's only 10% of the incarcerated population. So we think that our plan will have like a bigger effect, and it doesn't change the financial incentives that are set up in the crime bill of 1994, which right now are like incentivizing people to, or states to have more arrest and incarceration.
Okay.
So the plan would reverse that.
Okay, so how does your plan access the private prisons, like the other 90% of prisons that we want to you want to de-escalate the incarceration rate?
So first of all, the states will still have incentives for just their state's incarceration rate to be lower. So like just their police force, how kind of like it changes larger incentives for state policy, which could change private prison regulations and things like that, since it's kind of like a net grant to the states. Like, we'll give you this much money over 3 years if you produce these results. Now the states would want to produce those results, in which case they would use their power to regulate private prisons, even if they don't own them.
Okay, so there's no guarantee that they would access those private prisons? It's just like
funds, the Eisen evidence indicates that they almost accessed all of them. So we would think that they would also access it this time.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you.
Awesome. So next we have the first negative constructive, and I'm sure Trinity is going to use some prep time. So while she's preparing, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about what to expect. So we just heard the first affirmative constructive for 4 minutes. Secreti outlined the basis of her plan. So we had an advantage, which was poverty. And there's a harm in the status quo. Poverty is increasing. There's a cycle between being imprisoned and being trapped in poverty. And Secreti presented some evidence about the negative social implications of that. And then there were 2 things that were kind of important. First is solvency, which is how the affirmative solves the problem. Here, Secreti argued that the federal government has provided money to the states that has basically told them to build prisons and increase law enforcement. The plan reverses that and says, hey, instead, what we should be doing is we should be building less prisons and have less law enforcement. So if we reverse the financial incentive, the policy will change. And then she talked about inherency, and this was right at the beginning. Inherency is what's happening right now. And currently, the First Step Act was passed, which is a federal level reform. You heard Trinity asking about that in cross-examination. So we got to kind of determine what's happening now. There are some federal reforms. What does the plan do? Well, it helps the state get on board. And then why does that matter? Which is because of the link between imprisonment and poverty, particularly in communities of color in the United States. So I noticed that many of you marked that you're JV and varsity debater. One thing that you'll notice is that Trinity was setting up her arguments in the cross-examination. So she was asking about the difference between the plan and what was happening now. And she was also asking about why states would care about these funding grants. And I bet if we look to this next speech, we're probably going to hear some arguments about those things. So there's a clear link between her cross-examination and the constructive that she's about to read. So it looks like Trinity is probably about ready. I'm going to hand it over to her, and we'll have the first negative constructive where Trinity will outline her position against the plan proposed by Secreti. So take it away.
And again, just before we get into that, I want to go back to the flow really quick. And if your notes look like mine, where you have, the main arguments like inherency, solvency, advantage, or harms, that's great. If they don't have that, that's fine. You should just be writing down the main arguments as you understand them and as you hear them. if you can write down the key terminology or the authors or, pieces of data that you find really persuasive or important, that's great. If you can't do that yet, if you feel like you're just keeping up by writing down the main ideas and arguments, that's fine too. Another thing I want to get into before Trinity starts here, what Trinity is going to start with is called a disadvantage. If you haven't talked about disadvantages on your team yet, basically what a disadvantage is it's not saying that what the affirmative said is wrong, right? Like, it's not talking about solvency or inherency or advantage. Like, it's not talking about poverty or necessarily even prisons that much. A disadvantage is basically an unintended consequence of passing the plan. So Trinity could say, all that stuff you just said, Security, that makes a lot of sense, but there's something you forgot about, which is if you pass the plan, if you do the affirmative plan, it'll cause this unintended consequence, which is so much worse than the advantages that the plan is going to solve, that the harms would significantly outweigh the benefits. So it's what we call an off-case position. So Security presents the case, Trinity is presenting an off-case position. It's going to be the Federalism Disadvantage. If you're a novice, you have access to the Federalism Disadvantage. If you're a rookie, you don't yet. Rookies and novices have access to the Movement's Disadvantage, though. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, or as we're going through this, as she's talking about federalism, if it doesn't quite make sense to you, don't worry about it. Sometimes arguments are hard the first time around you hear them, but Clay and Sukriti and Trinity are going to explain them in more depth as the speeches go on. So just write down what you can, find out what you can, and we'll learn more as we go through the debate.
The negative team agrees that mass incarceration has many adverse effects on our country. However, the negative team believes that the way the affirmative team is proposed.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to restart her speech with the note that if this is, she starts off pretty fast, but she slows down after a while. But if this is too fast for you, if everything in here is too fast for you, feel free to go to the settings on your video and change the playback speed so that's a little bit slower. Or if this is really easy for you so far in your team, you can go ahead and crank up the settings to be faster, okay? We'll restart here.
The negative team agrees that mass incarceration has many adverse effects on our country. However, the negative team believes that the way the affirmative team is proposing to solve our mass incarceration problem will do more harm than good. The first disadvantage of the affirmative plan is the Federalism Disadvantage. Currently, the states are attempting to end mass incarceration on their own, and if the federal government steps in now, this will undermine the states' current efforts and upset the balance of federalism. This balance of power between the states and the federal government is fragile and must be maintained in order to address global warming and its eventual impact, which is extinction. First is uniqueness. The states are leading on criminal justice reform. The plan undermines federalism. This comes from Lesser in 2018. State and local governments are the primary entities that can implement federal regulations and recommendations. While the states are responsible for implementing federal policies, they can also limit federal influence where they see state law taking precedence. When it comes to criminal justice reform, those ideas are being developed and implemented at the state level. Second is the link. Grant conditions are a unique threat to federalism from Soman in 2019. Congressionally authorized grant conditions can undermine diversity in policy. The potential threat to federalism is heightened by the threat of the separation of powers. Third is the internal link. Federalism is key to solve global warming. This comes from Graham in 2018. Given the size and economic clout of many US states, as well as the fact that utilities are controlled at the city or state level, climate is an area in which subnational US jurisdictions can have a substantial impact. 34 states have climate action plans, and states will be significant in both in terms of how much state policies can contribute to global greenhouse gas targets and in maintaining confidence in international climate agreements. Fourth is the impact. Warming causes extinction. This comes from Torres in 2016. According to the IPCC, the effects of climate change will be severe and irreversible, and it could result in widespread social unrest, economic instability, and loss of human life. If you vote for the affirmative team and pass their plan, the balance of state and federal powers will be disrupted, and this will hurt not only efforts to end mass incarceration, but also efforts to curb the effects of global warming, and the impact will ultimately lead to extinction. Then moving on to her case, On inherency, current federal reforms solve the plan is not necessary. This comes from Lopez in 2019. The First Step Act takes steps to alter the federal criminal justice system and ease very punitive prison sentences. The law allows thousands of people to earn an earlier release from prison and could cut many more prison sentences in the future. You can also look back to our evidence from Lesser in 2018 that says that state and local governments are already working on criminal justice reforms on their own. Then moving on to solvency, the plan can't solve. The political reality outweighs financial incentives. This comes from McRae in 2017. The Reverse Mass Incarceration Act is a proposal to amend the 1994 crime bill. Experts are skeptical that grants are the best way forward. There's tremendous political risk. Of the $12.5 billion in federal funds earmarked by the 1994 crime bill for states that introduced tougher sentencing laws, only $2.7 billion was claimed, which is an indication that these federal grants are ignored. There's also no guarantee that the states will be able to convince private prisons to reduce their incarceration rate. There's no reason that a private prison would want to reduce their incarceration rate because this is how they make money. So that's another flaw as to how this plan would be able to solve. Next is the poverty advantage. Poverty is declining now. Statistics prove from Benson and Binshaw in 2019. The share of the US population below the poverty level dropped between 2017 and 2018, the 5th consecutive annual drop. For the 4th year in a row, the percentage of people in poverty decreased in the 3 most populous metropolitan areas. So the 3 reasons that you should be voting negative today are that the affirmative can't solve because the states aren't going to accept the money and they won't be able to convince private prisons to reduce their incarceration rates. Second is that there's already legislation in place and the states are already working towards a solution. And third is that the affirmative team actually makes mass incarceration worse because states are already working towards solutions and the plan would be a federal intervention that would upset the balance of federalism and cause significantly worse effects such as extinction through our global warming impact. Thank you.
So they're going to do cross-examination now. Security is going to ask questions of Trinity. And again, if you feel like you don't understand or exactly understand the story that Trinity is telling here, don't worry about it. We're going to touch back on it with Clay in a second, okay?
Okay. Cross-legs?
Yeah.
Sounds good. Starting it now. Your solvency evidence says that there's like a political risk to decreasing incarceration right now, and it's stronger than the incentive provided by the grants. What political risks are there to decreasing incarceration?
The political risk for state and local governments would be that like these big private prisons that they're trying to get to stop incarcerating more and more people, those big private prisons won't want to do that because that's how they make money. And the people that run those private prisons hold a lot of power within those jurisdictions, and so they don't want to lose
Okay, you also mentioned that states are working towards solutions now. How can they be working towards effective solutions if you say that they're also kind of mired within this private prison industry?
Yeah, so for one, they could be like focusing a lot of their efforts towards those federal prisons, but also I think the issue is more of like the federal government coming in and like forcing them to lose that political capital that they would have with the people that run those industries, rather than them being able to come up with their own plans, which they're already doing, that would potentially alleviate any of the like political issues that would come up if they were to disrupt the private prison industry within their states.
Okay. The federal government is already providing some incentives for the states in the 94 crime bill, like we've talked about. Why does a plan which just changes the incentives or reverses them, like a new imposition of federalism, if we already have these grants in place?
Yeah, so the reason that it's a new imposition is because it's going against what like the norm would be and what the like the for-profit prison industry, they want to increase their mass incarceration. So the fact that like the 1994 crime bill was giving the states money to help those private prisons continue doing that means that it wasn't federal overreach because it was like going along with what would help the state governments politically. But now when it's the opposite way, that's going to disrupt like political powers within the states and cause backlash. And so that's why it's federal overreach.
Okay, thank you.
So next up, we have the 1AR, the first affirmative rebuttal. But before we get there, let's kind of recap what's going on. So
Clay's going to talk about the arguments here, and he's going to explain federalism the Federalism Disadvantage in a little more detail.
So in the 1AC, Sukriti proposed a plan, the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act, that changes some financial incentives around, provides some federal grants to help states reduce their prison populations. In the 1NC, Trinity, made a couple of arguments against that. The first is this Federalism Disadvantage. Now, a disadvantage is a reason why the plan is a bad idea. It says that the costs of the plan outweigh the benefits and that the plan can have some unintended consequences. So I see a lot of questions about federalism in the Q&A. So why don't we kind of go through this? The basic argument in the disadvantage is that federalism, which is the division of power between the states and the federal government, is a good thing. And the reason it's a good thing is because it allows states to have flexibility to be laboratories of experimentation, to create policies that have good effects. It's not just one size fits all with the federal government. The disadvantage argues that currently states are taking the lead on criminal justice reform. Currently, for example, in the environment, you've seen a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, and states are currently taking the lead to say, all right, we should do things to reduce prison populations, etc. That's that's an example of federalism, right? The states are taking the lead. The problem is that the federal government comes in and says, hey, I'll give you billions of dollars if you do what I want. That means that those financial incentives that the plan provides actually just represent an example of federal control. Because what do you think is going to happen if the states do something that the federal government doesn't like? Well, historically, the federal government is going to threaten to cut off that funding. So instead of the states being able to act independently and experiment, what's going to happen is that the federal government now controls criminal justice policy in the United States. So Sukriti asked some good questions to push back against that, namely why the plan, which just changes current grants, is a new imposition on federalism. The other question was about the internal link. So an internal link is, okay, the plan harms federalism. You heard Trinity talk about global warming potentially being bad. So how do we get from point A, reducing federalism, to point B, which is global warming? An internal link tells us how we do that. The argument is that currently the states have independently formed, outside of the federal government, a climate compact, an agreement where they work to reduce emissions. And that's important because it means that the states have a leadership role internationally in climate change agreements. They can help set some norms to reduce emissions. If the federal government just takes control over federalism and the states no longer play that role, then they wouldn't be able to positively influence climate policy internationally, and climate change would run rampant. That at least is the argument. So in the 1AR, what can we kind of expect? We have a case, which is the plan, and we have an off case, which is the disadvantage. Sukriti needs to talk about her plan and why it's good, and also refute the negatives arguments as to why it's bad. So I'm going to go ahead and let Sukriti take it away here. Feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. Keep rolling right along. So Sukriti, first affirmative rebuttal.
First, I'll start on the case. The advantage outweighs the plan, and the advantage of the plan outweighs the disadvantage. Prison it causes incarcerated people and their families to get stuck in a poverty trap. It impacts social, educational, and health outcomes of entire communities. Let's go to inherency. The first step back is not enough. Incarceration rates are still extremely high, top in the world, and it only affects federal prisons, which is only 10% of incarcerated individuals. That's the Fable evidence. Let's go to solvency. Yes, financial incentives solve. The 94 bill successfully employed incentives in the past, and our plan just reverses them. Their evidence argues that grants won't work because the states did not use all the funding and there's too much political risk. First of all, it's incorrect because ultimately most of the funds were used. That's the Shelton and Eisen evidence. And two, it actually supports the AF because as the negative mentioned, there's some movement towards reducing incarceration, but we still need to change the remaining hurdle of perverse financial incentives. This also ties into the private prison argument because the negative argues that states have good plans to solve mass incarceration, but it also says that private prisons make it hard to do those reforms, and the federal government is the only actor that can kind of overcome the opposite financial incentive that the private prison lobby is pressuring the states with. Let's go to the poverty advantage. They say it's decreasing, but their card decides only 7 out of 25 major metropolitan areas. Most stay the same. And moreover, regardless of like small decreases, big effects of the population are obviously still being effective. So it's a more, you should still pass the plan. Let's go to the disadvantage. The case impact is more important than the disadvantage, and you should focus on the immense harms that are happening right now for low-income communities rather than far-off climate change. And it's non-unique. Trump has already undermined federalism. That's Gawthorpe in 2020. Trump will dole out federal largesse according to political loyalty. Democratic governors need to help themselves. Republican governors need to stick close. Result has been an inversion of what the founders intended. Federalism has become another casualty of a president unprecedented in his disregard. Second, there's already incentives in place now. The plan just reverses them, so it's not a new example of federal power, and it doesn't matter what's politically popular at the time. It's just not a new imposition. Third is federalism is resilient. That's Rodriguez in 14. The value of the system is the framework for ongoing negotiation. Federalism creates a multiplicity of institutions to develop national consensus while establishing a system that allows for meaningful disagreement. These debates play out in discretionary spaces. Winners must sometimes emerge. Intergovernmental relationships are neither locked in zero-sum competition nor bound by fixed rules of engagement, precisely what makes federalism productive regardless of perspective. And there's no link. Their evidence is too much about executive control over grant conditions and it's not about Congress, which is what our plan does. And there's no impact to climate change because eventually we can maybe adapt in the future since it's so far away, and their card does not give a time frame.
So, pretty rough speech. It's a super short speech. You have a lot to respond to. The 1AR is probably the most difficult speech in this debate, so props to Sukriti for getting through. So as we kind of talk about this, let's see what y'all are thinking. Let's see who y'all will think will win. So if you're an attendee, you just saw a poll pop up on your screen.
And again, this is for their camp that they're doing this demo debate, so you're not going to see any polls or anything here, but this is a good time to talk with your coach and peers about who you think is winning and why, like who has the better arguments, who has a story that makes more sense to you, and who is using the evidence better to tell their story. Would you vote for the affirmative team to pass the act to end mass incarceration, or would you vote for the negative team to preserve federalism and not pass the end mass incarceration act?
Who do we think is going to win? A lot of you think it's too close to tell. Some of you say the affirmative, some of you say the negative. So let's talk about what Sukriti did there. So the first thing that she started off with was really important. It's called impact calculus. She said that the advantage is reducing poverty is more important than the disadvantage or the potential threat of climate change. And that's really important because ultimately debate is about costs and benefits. The potential cost of the plan is climate change. The potential benefit is massively reducing poverty. So Sukriti said, well, climate change might have some impacts in 100 years or so, but poverty is affecting real people right now. So there's a very high probability the plan would reduce poverty. There's a relatively low probability that climate change would happen in 100 years or so. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is she did something really good where she was identifying the arguments she was answering. So you'll notice that there was inherency, there was solvency, and then there was the advantage. And she went through both those, right? She said, now on to solvency, now on to the disadvantage, now on to the poverty advantage. That really helps your judge know about what arguments you're trying to answer. So she was really organized in her speech, and that was pretty good. The last thing that I want to point out is that she spent a lot of time comparing and saying why her arguments were more important than her opponent's arguments. That type of argument comparison is what wins you the debate. Because the 1AR can't answer everything the 1NC says. There's just too many arguments, right? You have 3 minutes to respond to a 4-minute speech, and then Trinity is about to have another long negative rebuttal. So that means that we got to think about prioritizing our best arguments and explaining why those arguments are more important than anything our opponents might say. So in a short debate, when we have 3 minutes to give a solid speech, we got to say these are our best couple of arguments and really roll with them. So looking at y'all, many of you say that it's too close to tell. And right now, I agree. It really comes down to what's going to happen in the negative rebuttal. So let's talk about that. The negative rebuttal, Trinity isn't going to try to go for every argument that she made in the first negative constructive. Instead, she's going to focus on a couple of her most important arguments. I bet one of those things will be the Federalism Disadvantage and talking about how the impact, climate change, is more important than the potential benefit of the plan, which is poverty reduction. Similarly, she's probably going to talk about one or two of the arguments against the case, probably talk about how poverty is already being reduced in the status quo, and probably talk about some of those case arguments about how potentially the funding mechanism of the plan doesn't work out. So one other thing is that I see some folks asking again about federalism. Federalism Disadvantage just says the state should take the lead on things. And the federal government in the plan takes the lead on things, which is bad because it means that the federal government ends up overpowering the states. So the states can't work independently. So let's go ahead and see how we're feeling for the 1NR, the first negative rebuttal. Trinity is going to pick some arguments, some of the right ones, and then say that the negative won the debate. Conversely, Sukriti during this prep time is probably thinking about what were my best arguments from the 1AR to think about what should make it into the 2AR, because the 2AR is going to be a real short speech. So she has to already have an idea in mind as to what arguments she should go for. Otherwise, that 2AR prep time is going to be real rough. So I'm going to turn it over for the first negative rebuttal. Take it away.
I know Clay just said a lot of things, but I do want to emphasize, the further you get into the debate, into the rebuttals, you don't have to talk about every single piece of evidence or argument. You choose your best arguments that are going to help you tell your story in the most convincing way. So to explain to the judge, you should vote negative because if you vote negative, these good things will happen or these bad things won't happen. What are the arguments you need to tell that story? Same thing for the affirmative. When you get into the 1AR or the 2AR, the last two speeches for the affirmative, what evidence is going to help you tell the judge and persuade the judge that voting for the affirmative is going to give you more advantages, more benefits than harms it will create, okay?
There are three main reasons that the negative team should win today's debate. The first being that the affirmative cannot solve because the states won't accept the money and state governments will not be able to convince private prisons to reduce their incarceration rates. The second is that their plan is unnecessary because there's already legislation at the state and federal levels working to reduce incarceration rates. And the third is that their plan is a massive overreach by the federal government that will hurt the efforts the states are already making to reduce incarceration and will result in a disruption of federalism, which leads to an exacerbation of impacts such as global warming. So first on the Federalism Dissad, we want to look at uniqueness. The evidence that the affirmative team reads from Gothorpe talks about Trump making different decisions about ventilators for two specific instances of different states, and this pales in comparison to the overreach that the affirmative would be making by implementing a nationwide change in incarceration policies that would be stepping on the toes of state governments. To reiterate from our lesser in 2018 evidence in the 1NC, states are already working towards solutions at their own pace, and pressure from the federal government will only disrupt these plans and have widespread negative impacts in the future. Second, the affirmative claims that their plan isn't a new example of federal power. However, reducing the incarceration rate will cause political backlash against state legislators and local officials in affected areas, whereas the previous funds in place didn't cause this backlash. If anything, they were favorable for political reasons to state officials. Third, the affirmative also claims that federalism is resilient. However, even small changes snowball and states need leverage to check federal power. This comes from Buckley in 2015. If federal regulation removes states from the scene, there is no meaningful sense in which states can serve to protect these values. As affirmative federal power has grown, the baseline for what the federal government can demand from states in a cooperative arrangement has grown. Then fourth, our link evidence from Soman explicitly states that congressionally authorized grants harm diversity in policy. The affirmative is congressionally authorized grants, meaning it triggers the link to the disruption of federalism, which hurts the ability of states to work with the federal government towards a solution to lots of issues such as climate change. Then onto our impact of climate change. Climate change would have devastating effects for our environment and would worsen all of the impacts of the affirmative. Climate change exacerbates poverty and hurts disenfranchised people the most. This impact outweighs any of the advantages from the affirmative, and in fact cancels out their advantages because the dismantling of federalism will exacerbate the problems they claim to solve. Also, we are seeing the effects of climate change now, with many natural disasters increasing in recent years. And again, the damages from these disasters are disproportionately impacting disadvantaged populations and exacerbating poverty. Then moving on to case, first on inherency. Again, there are already policies at the state and federal level that are addressing this issue. Then moving on to solvency. The states are not going to accept these funds. With the 1994 crime bill, the states only used a fraction of the money that the federal government offered them to increase incarceration rates. That's our evidence from McRae in 2017 that gives specific numbers as to how much the states use, which was only 2.7 billion out of 12.5 billion offered. Also, the affirmative plan cannot guarantee a reduction in the 90% of prisons that are not run by the federal government. Private prisons are not going to want to reduce their incarceration rates because this would cause them to lose money. Then on their poverty advantage, the affirmative is going to exacerbate poverty by hurting the state's ability to pass critical legislation, such as legislation that would prevent climate change, and the impacts of this would increase wealth inequalities and poverty way more than the affirmative would alleviate it. Again, the affirmative cannot solve because states won't take the money and they can't convince private prisons to halt their operations. It's unnecessary because legislation already exists that's working to reduce the rate of incarceration at state and local levels. And lastly, and most importantly, their plan will upset the balance of powers between the states and the federal government, which prevents the states from furthering their current efforts to reduce incarceration and hurts the ability of states to work towards solutions to climate change, which will have devastating effects for our country that outweigh the effects of the status quo. Thank you.
Let's talk about a couple of things as Sukriti prepares for the 2AR. So during that negative rebuttal, you'll notice that Trinity didn't go for every argument. Instead, she did a couple of things to help win the debate. And the first thing she did at the very top of her speech at the very beginning is she gave 3 reasons why she won the debate. And that's really helpful to your judge because your judge is going to be wondering, well, who should I vote for at the end of the debate, right? And it's your job to help write that ballot, to explain, hey, I won the debate because the federalism disadvantage is really important. I won the debate because the poverty advantage is really important. I won the debate because my evidence is better. So talking about why you're winning the debate is really important for the judge to help write that ballot. Now, another thing that Trinity did that I thought was pretty good is she identified the arguments that she was answering. So she said the affirmative claims that federalism is resilient, for example. However, and then she would make her arguments. That tells the judge what argument that you're answering. So the affirmative says this, here's my response. They say X, I say Y. And lastly, you'll notice that in the 1 and C, she made 3 arguments against the case. On inherency, she said the First Step Act made the plan not necessary. On solvency, she said that federal funding would be ineffective and states wouldn't follow it. And then third, the poverty advantage, she answered the poverty advantage, she claimed that poverty is being reduced in the status quo. Now, she really only picked one of those arguments to really hammer in on. So she picked the solvency argument, and she said that solvency means that even if there is a problem, even if it's true that there is a link between prison and poverty, the plan doesn't help solve that problem because states will ignore federal funding grants. And that's super important. Why is it important? Because it means that Sukriti can win her arguments about poverty and about the First Step Act not doing enough and still lose the debate. Similarly, Sukriti is probably going to pick 1 or 2 arguments against the federalism disadvantage because she doesn't have a ton of time. So in the 2AR, we can expect some more impact calculus. Why is the advantage of the plan important? And similarly, why is the disadvantage not as important? And probably pick 1 argument or 2 arguments against the federalism disadvantage. So Sukriti has a little bit of extra prep time, but if she's good to go, I'm going to hand it over to her. And then afterwards, we'll be able to talk about the debate. Y'all will be able to vote, so keep in mind who you want to vote for. And Sukriti, if you're ready, take it away.
Sounds good. Okay. The poverty advantage outweighs the long impacts of climate change. You have to believe that changing the federal incentives that are already there are going to change the structure so much that the states aren't going to be able to do climate solutions, and that we're not going to be able to do climate change. We change incentives for 1 grant. So it's kind of one of those things about a low probability and a high magnitude. Like, yeah, climate change can be really scary, but if it's unlikely to happen, you should still prefer something that can have a good impact on a decent amount of the population and have positive impacts for our communities. And our impact does outweigh. There is a lot of people suffering right now. There are educational impacts on the children. There are income impacts. There are health impacts. It's a big community-wide effect. And since it affects so many people, not just the incarcerated individuals, you should make this an urgent issue to solve first. Now, let's go on to the case proper. First is inherency. They didn't mention why the First Step Act is enough. I already explained it only impacts federal prisons. This would impact all prisons because it gives states an incentive to reduce overall. And this sets up a new grant system, which the First Step Act did not. Next, solvency. Yes, the financial incentives solved. The 94 bill has successfully increased incarceration rates a lot. So even that amount of funding was able to do that, even if they do not end up using all the funds. Maybe if they are not, there is still movement towards decarceration, which means that states are likely going to move in that direction if they are able to. And we solved the private prisons argument because, as I said, private prisons block reform, and our argument is that the federal government would provide financial incentives to kind of overcome that push by private prisons. Now, let's go to the Federalism Disadvantage. So I've already explained why the case is more important than the disadvantage. And now I'll explain that even if you think climate change is really bad, there's no link at all to the disadvantage. It's because there's already a federal imposition of power, and it's because the federalism is resilient, even if it's cooperative, even if there's balance in one area, it's not zero sum.
So really good job.
Okay, so she kind of cut out a little bit at the end there. Basically, the argument she's making is that even if the case, even if passing the plan would take some power away from the states, it doesn't really matter because the states already have so much power taken away from them, which is the argument that federalism is already collapsing, that passing the plan doesn't matter. And then the second argument she made is that federalism is resilient, which basically means even if the states have power taken away from them, they eventually gain it back anyway. Like the balance gets restored anyway. As a judge or commenter, this is not something that would normally happen in the debate where someone explains it to you, but I just wanted to re-explain that because she goes very quickly at the end there and there's some technical language.
Unfortunately, we're virtual, but if you want to give a little mini round of applause for our debaters here. It's tough debating in front of folks. We have quite a few people here, so thank you so much to them. So now we're going to vote, and we're going to determine who won the debate.
Okay, before they go into that, I think this is pretty much the end of the video in terms of the MDTA Jamboree. You should take some time right now to discuss with your coach and your peers about who you think won the debate and why. And of course, when you're making a decision in debate, you want judges to judge you based on the arguments you made and what you said, right? So you should judge these debaters and this debate in that same way. So look at your flow, look at the arguments that you have written down, and think about, okay, we have we have two competing stories here, right? The negative story is that if you vote for the affirmative, it won't actually solve any of the problems that they talk about, and it'll take power away from the states. And if the states don't have power, they can't do what they need to do to solve climate change, right? Because the only hope is for the states to solve climate change. The people in Congress and the White House probably aren't going to do it for us. The other story that's happening here is that Security's telling the story of the affirmative. And she says, there's all this money coming from the federal government to the states and to prisons to put people in jail. If we cut off that funding, states and prisons won't do that anymore. And a lot of people who would otherwise be in jail won't be in jail anymore. And that's a really important thing, right? Because it'll help keep people out of poverty, and they'll have much better lives by not being in jail. So that's a pretty important impact for those negative things not to happen to people. So even if there is some chance, like in 100 years, that doing the plan might make it slightly less probable that climate change gets solved, it's still more important to focus on getting those people out of prison, keeping them out of prison, and making sure they don't fall into poverty due to being in prison, right? So those are the two competing stories you have in this debate, and they're using evidence and their own explanations and comparisons to tell that story. So I want to give you and your coach and your peers some time to talk it over, decide who you think won and why, based on which evidence and arguments, which set of evidence and arguments were more compelling to you. So you can pretty much turn the video off now and do that. Once you're done, just head over to the main room, the second link that you have in that email you got, and it will bring you to a room where you can talk with some debate experts and some folks who would love to talk more debate with you, okay? I'm gonna let the rest of the video play out in case you wanna hear Clay and the other people who were involved, what they have to say about the debate and their reflections on what happened in the debate. There's some really good information in it, but if you feel like you don't want some of that deeper strategy or explanations, you should feel free to just talk amongst yourselves and then head over to the MDTA debriefing room, okay? Thanks for your time, and I think you're gonna have some great debates today, and I think you're gonna really enjoy it, so I hope I see you later in the day.
But before we do that, we got to think about what happened in the debate and how we could make a decision. So Sukriti started off her 2AR by saying that there's kind of two things that you have to believe in order to vote negative. The first is that climate change is a really serious threat, would somehow undermine international climate policy. Conversely, in Trinity's speech, you have to believe in order to vote affirmative that the plan will somehow reverse decades of financial incentives to create prisons. And second, that the plan would not negatively impact federalism. So both debaters did a really good job explaining what the judge should think. So if you think the plan is a good idea, you probably think that the plan changes some financial incentives, which is good. And you probably think that poverty is an immediate impact that can be solved, whereas climate change is far off in the future. If you voted negative, you probably think that there's a very low risk, even if poverty is important, that the plan can resolve that problem because their states really don't care about federal grants. And you also probably think that the plan takes over and hijacks state level reforms that are happening now, which could undermine our climate policy. So let's go ahead and see who we think won the debate, and we'll go from there. So in a second, we're going to release the results of that poll, and we'll see who won the pot. But I also want to give Trinity and Sukriti an opportunity to talk about what they thought happened in the debate. Probably pick potentially your best arguments, and then what you were thinking going into the last rebuttal. So I'll start with you, Trinity, since Sukriti just spoke. What were you thinking going into the last rebuttal, and what was your best argument you thought?
I think I was focusing a lot on solvency and proving why the plan couldn't solve, because if they can't solve for their poverty advantage, then there's no reason to vote for the affirmative. We might as well just stick with the status quo. So I was focusing on those two arguments on solvency about how the states aren't going to use the funding because they didn't do that in the past, and then also that they're not going to be able to stop the for-profit prison industry, because why would those people want to stop when they're making so much money off of it?
So for the 2AR, I was thinking, first of all, I have to go with the kind of probability type of impact calculus scenario, because I knew that the strength of my advantage was definitely the fact that it's happening right now, and we know that the impact itself is probable. It's just the question of solvency. And I wanted to compare that with the lack of probability, or the low probability of the disadvantage through the link argument. So the link argument is just that it's not a huge change from the status quo, and kind of federalism is resilient, so the link doesn't work like that it collapses all of federalism all at once. So even if I lost a little bit on solvency, if you thought that climate change was just so improbable, even a little bit of solvency is good.
Okay, let's switch it around. What do you think was the weakest argument that you made? Where do you think you were most vulnerable and you were kind of worried about?
I think that the link to the Federalism Disadvantage is the weakest thing, and it's hard to uphold because it's just such a it's just a hard argument to make that a small policy like this, I guess it's a big policy, but a policy like this, even though there's so many policies that the federal government imposes on the states, that this is going to be the one that causes like massive upheaval of the state's ability to do anything. So I think that's the hardest thing to support.
The climate change impact is really big, so not having any type of like major response to that is kind of a little bit nervous, but I also didn't get enough time, I think, for time management in the 2AR to get to the link arguments. So if I was going to go with that strategy and kind of bank on the link arguments, just making sure that you know, you have more time because climate change is kind of a weakness or something you have to look out for.
So Trinity, you said the weakest part was the federalism link, and Sukriti, you said the most worrisome thing was the federalism impact. So how did you kind of design your debate strategy in order to account for that?
I think for me, before the debate, I knew that piece of evidence was, or like that link was going to be a little bit shaky, and there's going to be a lot of things she could say about it. So I kind of came up with reasons in my head as to why the link does make sense, so that I could try to convince the judge that the link is real and that we are going to see the impacts of it.
Yeah, basically the same things. I knew the same thing about kind of the link argument I was a little bit iffy about, so the kind of probability, and I knew climate change was a huge impact, so I had to do something to hedge against that, and so that's why I kind of went with that strategy. But one thing I would want to say is that like Trinity did a really good job. Like she had so much stuff on the link in the 1NR, but even though that happened, like if you know that an argument is right, like a link argument is just like you think that's still the best argument, unless it's impossible, like don't be afraid of still going through and answering that, because you know like maybe that is just better on the app side, and just like trust yourself with that.
Yeah, I think that both sides here kind of have some weak spots. I think the affirmative solvency was really talked about in this debate, and then the negative link is always the weakest part of any disadvantage. So let's go ahead and see who won the debate. Let's share some results. The affirmative, by a 2/3 margin, won the debate. Gave that persuasive 2AR, I guess, Sukriti.
All right, looks like that's it. Again, if you've made it this far, you've probably learned a lot, I hope. One thing I'd like to encourage you to do is, if you go back to the MDTA room where you can talk with a debate expert and deep debate. All right, there we go. Talk about your flow, talk about the arguments you have written down, and then just talk about like what the stories in the debate were. How do the two stories compare with each other? Because as a debater, that's your number one goal by the end of the debate, is to be able to say, okay, judge, here's my story. If you vote for us, these good things happen, these bad things don't happen. If you vote for my opponent, these good things won't happen and these bad things will happen. And being able to explain that through your evidence and your argument and your logic, and being able to compare those two stories. That's really your only job. So figuring out with your coach, the other debaters, and that debate expert, how to do that, and how to do that with your own evidence and your own arguments, and through your own prism of life understanding, is going to be your main job. So thank you so much for attending with us. I hope you have a good debate later today, and I think you'll have a lot of fun. So enjoy the rest of the experience, and hopefully I will be able to judge or talk to you soon on a more personal level.